Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just picking up on what Senator Klobuchar just said, a brief commercial. The Food and Drug Administration is undergoing a reauthorization process next year. It'll be tough because it's a political year as well, but this is absolutely critical. Our ability for the approval of new medical devices is something where we're severely insufficient in this country. We're driving that business overseas, that investment overseas. At the same time, under the Affordable Care Act, we're going to be taxing that segment of our intellectual capital, and I just think it's unconscionable the way we've behaved. We hear a lot of talk about the $1 trillion sitting on the sidelines, that corporations have $1 trillion that they're just waiting to see what's going to happen. Is that accurate?
I think it's more than that. I think it's more like $2 trillion.
And what is it that they're waiting to see?
Well, partly it's liquidity preference from the crisis, where they want to make sure they have enough cash on hand in case there are more financial issues. But more generally, I think...
So are those capital requirements that you have imposed? Or
I'm talking now about corporations, not about banks.
Okay.
Corporations remain very, I think, uncertain about the strength of the recovery. They at this point, they are able to meet demand with their existing capital stocks and workforces, and they're looking to see a stronger recovery and greater clarity before they deploy some of those funds.
And is that greater clarity from the legislative branch, or from the Federal Reserve, or from the executive branch? Where is that clarity?
Well, it comes from many areas. I think first and foremost, will the recovery continue and be strong, or will it falter? And there's a lot of uncertainty about what the economy is going to do. Certainly policy uncertainty is an important issue. As far as the Federal Reserve is concerned, we in our regulatory efforts are doing our best to move as quickly as possible to provide clarity about the regulatory framework that we're responsible for.
Sure. Do you think tax policy influences it?
It's possible, yes. In general, again, the more clarity we can provide to firms and households, the more likely they are to make commitments of various sorts.
Let me ask you a question. I need to move on because time is limited. Do you think that the actions that have been taken in the last 3 years have prevented a recurrence of the events that we saw in September of 2008? Have we prevented the next meltdown?
I think that we made a substantial improvement in the situation.
Wrong answer. Have we prevented? Have we prevented? It's a yes or no question.
If we had not taken those actions, we wouldn't have had to prevent, because we would have had a collapse.
Let me ask you this. A lot of people talk about the reinstitution of Glass-Steagall. You mentioned moral hazard. Do we need to draw that bright line again?
I don't think Glass-Steagall per se would have avoided the crisis. Many investment banks or commercial banks that were not combined had problems. We've made a lot of steps to try to address those issues. I know not everybody agrees on all of them, but I think we've made a lot of progress in getting our financial system back on a more stable footing.
Let me ask you this. In your testimony, the second to the last paragraph, the closing sentence, you said the committee will continue to monitor economic developments and is prepared to take further action. Do you have other arrows in your quiver at this point? Have most of them already been used? Is the only arrow you have left the printing press?
Well, the basic tool that the Federal Reserve has is operations in the open market that may or may not increase the money supply. But the attempts to reduce interest rates and to create more financial accommodation, we do have tools, but obviously we want to evaluate the costs and the benefits of any decisions we take, and we want to make sure that the economy is getting the appropriate amount of stimulus from us.
So the answer to that question is the printing press may be the only arrow left in your quiver?
Well, the printing press, I think that's a rather unfair characterization. The printing press literally is not actually involved. I mean, what we're doing right now, for example, is selling short-term securities and buying long-term securities. We're not changing the size of our balance sheet, and we're not changing the size of the money supply in any significant way.
As long as it works. Let me just ask you something unrelated, because my time's running out. You see protests both on the right and the left. Right now, the protests that are getting the headlines are on the left in New York. What is that protest saying to you? What are you hearing from that activity in New York right now?
Well, I would just say very generally, I think people are quite unhappy with the state of the economy and what's happening. They blame with some justification the problems in the financial sector for getting us into this mess. And they're dissatisfied with the policy response here in Washington. And at some level, I can't blame them. Certainly 9% unemployment and very slow growth is not a very good situation. That's what they're protesting.
And are you incorporating that into the remedies that you're proposing?
I'm taking into account the growth rate and the unemployment rate as well as the inflation rate. I'm not taking the protests into account specifically, but I certainly, like everyone else, I'm dissatisfied with what the economy is doing right now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Representative Burgess.